Pembina County, North Dakota, September 1948. The air held the first clean, sharp bite of autumn, a promise of what was to come. The wheat was in, the combines were silent, and the men of the county turned their minds to the hardening of their homesteads against the inevitable siege of winter. On a small plot of land west of the Tongue River, Stanislaw Kowalski was digging a hole. It was not a root cellar nor a well. It was a massive rectangular pit, nearly 50 feet long and 20 wide, excavated directly beside the fresh concrete footings of a new barn. Day after day, the metallic scrape of his shovel and the rhythmic thud of earth hitting the growing mound were the only sounds from his quarter section. His neighbors, driving past on the dirt road, would slow their trucks, lean out their windows, and watch the quiet, methodical man working in his pit. Jedediah Thorne, the best barn builder in 3 counties, stopped his Ford pickup one afternoon. He was a man whose confidence was built from solid oak beams and proven designs. He watched Stan, sweat-soaked and covered in dirt, wrestle a large rock from the pit wall. "Kowalski," Thorne called out, his voice carrying easy authority. "Lost something?" Amos Pritchett, whose farm adjoined Stan's, was with him. "Heard you were building a house, Stan? Not digging a grave for it?" Stan paused, wiped his brow with the back of a dusty hand, and looked up at them. He offered no smile, just a calm acknowledgement. "I am building a house," he said, his Polish accent still thick after 3 years on the prairie. Thorne squinted, his gaze shifting from the pit to the disassembled arches of a military surplus Quonset hut lying nearby. The pieces of corrugated metal gleamed dully in the sun. "You're not planning on putting that tin can in that hole, are you? Man's got to be a gopher to live underground. The spring thaw will turn you into a mud puddle. It's the most foolish thing I've ever seen." Stan simply nodded. "The earth is a blanket," he said, and turned back to his work. The shovel bit into the soil again. Thorne and Pritchett exchanged a look, a shared shake of the head that sealed the community's judgment. The Polish fella, the one who worked in the shipyards back in the old country, was not just strange, he was crazy. What did this Polish shipyard engineer, a man who thought in terms of steel hulls and pressure dynamics, understand about thermal mass and waste heat recovery that a generation of expert prairie builders had missed? This story is about more than just a strange building. It's a lesson in seeing a problem differently, in understanding the invisible forces of heat and cold that govern survival on the frontier. The solution Stan Kowalski developed was so effective it would be quietly adopted across the region, saving families, livestock, and livelihoods. I promise that by the end of this, you'll understand the elegant physics behind his strange design. So, if you appreciate stories of ingenuity against the odds, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. Let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional solution to a common problem you've ever seen? Stanislaw Kowalski was a man forged in the confined spaces of the Gdansk shipyards. For 20 years, before the war tore his world apart, his universe had been the interior of steel vessels. He hadn't worked with wood and nails, he worked with rivets and welds, with ventilation shafts and engine manifolds. His specialty was submarines and large cargo ships, environments where every cubic foot of air was managed, every degree of temperature was accounted for, and every system had to work in harmony with the others. He didn't think in terms of rooms, he thought in terms of pressure zones. He didn't see a stove as just a heater, he saw it as one component in a complex thermal engine that included the crew's own body heat. He understood that a steel wall wasn't a barrier to the cold, but a rapid conductor of it, and that the only true insulation was a buffer of stable temperature, whether that was a vacuum, rock wool, or the deep, dark water of the Baltic Sea. When he arrived in North Dakota with his wife, Zofia, and their two small children, Antek and Kasia, he brought these skills with him. They were useless, it seemed, on the vast, open prairie. They bought their land with what little they had, and like everyone else, they faced their first winter in a hastily built claim shack. It was a wooden box, framed in the standard way, with single-pane windows and a tar paper roof. It was a structure designed by men who understood wood, but not thermal dynamics. That first winter was a brutal education. The wind, a physical presence on the plains, forced its way through every crack. Ice formed on the heads of the interior nails, perfect white blossoms of cold that conducted the killing frost straight through the walls. Zofia was constantly stuffing rags into the window frames, but it was a hopeless battle. They burned through their entire winter's supply of wood by the middle of January, a staggering 3 cords, and had to spend money they didn't have on overpriced coal from the general store in town. The children were perpetually sick, their small bodies racked with chest colds that lingered for weeks. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned. Stan, a man who had kept sailors alive deep beneath the ocean, felt a profound sense of failure. He couldn't even keep his own children warm. He would sit by the stove late at night, feeding it precious sticks of wood, watching the metal glow red hot while the corners of the small room remained freezing. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem was the house. It was a sieve, leaking precious life-sustaining heat into the infinite cold of the Dakota night. The conventional wisdom of Pembina County was built on experience, but it was the experience of fighting a battle of attrition. A farmhouse was a wooden fort, and winter was the enemy at the gates. The strategy was simple: burn more fuel. Jedediah Thorne's barns were masterpieces of post and beam construction. They could withstand a tornado. Their haylofts were cavernous, their foundations solid. But they were thermally no different from the shacks the settlers first built. They were single-skin structures, designed for shelter from wind and snow, not for retaining heat. The physics of their failure was straightforward. A standard wooden wall made of 1-inch pine boards had an R value of about 1. That meant it resisted heat flow, but very poorly. On a night when it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, a farmer would have to generate an immense amount of heat inside his barn just to keep the temperature above freezing. Most of this heat, produced by the animals themselves, went straight up. Heat rises, and the uninsulated roofs of these barns, often little more than planks and shingles, bled BTUS into the sky. The heat that didn't go up went out, conducted directly through the wooden walls. Farmers would see their livestock, especially those near the north and west walls, coated in a fine layer of frost on their backs. This was frozen condensation from their own breath, a visible sign of a losing battle. The animals were burning precious calories that should have gone to producing milk or gaining weight, simply to stay alive. The farmhouses were slightly better, but operated on the same flawed principle. They were balloon-framed, meaning the wall studs ran in single, uninterrupted lengths from the foundation to the roof. This created hollow cavities inside the walls that were perfect channels for air movement. Cold air would infiltrate near the bottom, get warmed by the stove, rise up through the wall cavities, and exit into the attic, pulling more cold air in behind it. It was a giant, unintentional convection engine designed for maximum heat loss. Families were living inside a radiator in reverse. They would huddle around the stove, warm on one side and cold on the other, while their home actively worked to pump their heat outside. This was the reality everyone accepted. Winter was misery. Survival meant having a bigger wood pile than your neighbor. Stanisław Kowalski refused to accept it. He knew the problem wasn't a lack of fuel. The problem was the vessel. As he spent that first spring and summer working for other farmers, saving every dollar, he wasn't just planning a new house. He was designing a new system. The work began in late August. The excavation of the pit was the most grueling part. The prairie soil was dense and clay-heavy, studded with rocks left behind by ancient glaciers. He worked alone, with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. When Zofia brought him his lunch, she would look at the hole with a worried expression. "Stanisław," she'd say in Polish, "the neighbors think you are digging to China." He would just pat her hand. "No, my love. I am digging for warmth." Once the pit reached a depth of 10 feet, well below the 4 to 5 foot frost line of North Dakota, he began assembling the Quonset hut. It was a surplus Type A, 16 feet wide and 36 feet long. He and Zofia, with the help of a simple block and tackle, bolted the corrugated steel arches together inside the pit. The structure took shape, a metallic caterpillar resting at the bottom of its earthen trench. This was what drew the most ridicule. "That thing is for storing airplanes, not people," Silas Croft, the owner of the general store, remarked to a group of men one afternoon. "The ground pressure alone will crumple it like a tin can when it gets wet." Jedediah Thorne was more specific in his criticism. "You have no foundation, Kowalski, just a dirt floor. And steel? Steel is the worst thing you can put in the ground. It'll rust through before your kids are grown. You need pressure-treated timber and a stone footing. You're building a ruin." Stan ignored them. Once the hut was assembled, he began the next crucial phase. He spent a week meticulously coating the entire exterior surface of the Quonset with hot tar, the same method used to waterproof the hull of a ship. He applied 2 thick, black, gleaming coats. Then, he laid a perimeter of drainage tiles around the base, leading to a shallow sump pit, a precaution against the spring thaw Jedediah had warned about. The most peculiar part of the construction came next. He acquired a 6-foot diameter section of galvanized steel culvert, 20 feet long. This was the shaft. He carefully cut a precise opening in the rear wall of the Quonset and another in the foundation wall of the barn he was building on the surface, directly adjacent to the pit. With immense effort, he maneuvered the massive culvert into place, connecting the subterranean dwelling to the barn's interior. It was a metal umbilical cord. He then wrapped the entire length of the culvert in a thick layer of rock wool insulation, securing it with wire. Finally, he began to backfill the pit. He didn't just dump the dirt back in. He did it carefully, compacting the soil in layers around the waterproofed hut. By the time he was finished, only the front face of the Quonset was visible, set back into a gently sloping earthen bank. It had a door and 2 small, deep-set windows. The rest of the structure was buried, invisible, embraced by the earth. On the surface, the new barn looked conventional, if a bit close to the strange, sunken doorway. Thorne made one last visit before the first snow. He walked the site, shaking his head. "You've connected your house to a stinking barn, the ammonia, the smell. Your wife will leave you by Christmas, of all the mad ideas." Stan was fitting a simple wooden damper inside the shaft, a handle extending into the barn. He looked at Thorne, his face calm and serious. "The animals make heat, Jedediah. It is a waste to let it fly to the sky. The earth is a blanket. The animals are a furnace. This," he said, patting the insulated shaft, "is the duct. It is a system." Thorne just laughed, a short, sharp bark. "It's a system for failure, my friend. We'll see who's warm in January." To understand the genius of Stan Kowalski's system, you have to understand 3 distinct principles of physics. The men who mocked him understood the prairie, but Stan understood the forces that governed it. First was the principle of thermal mass and geothermal stability. The surface of the earth in North Dakota experiences a brutal temperature swing, from 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer to -40 in the winter. But just a few feet down, that volatility vanishes. Below the frost line, the earth maintains a remarkably constant temperature, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. This is the planet's immense thermal mass at work. The ground isn't a source of heat in the way a fire is. It's a massive, stable temperature sink. A conventional house sitting on the surface is exposed on all sides to the punishing minus 40-degree air. It's like a bare-skinned man in a blizzard. Stan's house, buried in the earth, was only exposed on one small face. The other 90% of its surface area was touching 50-degree soil. The battle wasn't to raise the temperature from minus 40 to 70. The battle was to raise it from 50 to 70. He had eliminated the most extreme part of the cold before his stove was ever lit. The R value of a foot of compacted soil is only about R4, but Stan had 8 to 10 feet of it on all sides. More importantly, that soil was a buffer that would never drop below freezing. Jedediah saw a man burying a house. Stan saw a man wrapping his house in the single most effective blanket available, the planet itself. The second principle was waste heat recovery. A farm is a factory of heat. Jedediah Thorne saw his livestock as assets that needed to be protected from the cold. Stan saw them as biological furnaces. A single 1,000-pound dairy cow generates between 3,000 and 6,000 BTUs of heat per hour just by being alive. That's the equivalent of a 1,500-watt electric space heater. Stan's small herd of 8 cows, 10 pigs, and a flock of chickens collectively produced a staggering amount of thermal energy, upwards of 40,000 BTUs per hour. In a conventional barn, this heat was a waste product. It rose to the uninsulated ceiling and vanished into the atmosphere. The animals paid an energy penalty, burning feed to produce heat that was immediately thrown away. Stan saw this not as waste, but as the primary fuel source for his entire system. The third and most elegant principle was the passive convective loop, made possible by the insulated shaft. This was the secret sauce from his shipyard experience. The shaft was not just a tunnel for smells to travel through, it was a heat engine with no moving parts. The air in the barn, warmed by the animals and rich with moisture from their respiration, was buoyant. It was lighter than the air in the cooler, drier Quonset hut. The shaft was installed at a slight downward angle from the barn to the house. The warm, moist barn air would naturally rise into the top of the shaft. As it traveled along the insulated culvert, it would slowly transfer its heat to the air in the house. As it cooled, it became denser and sank, exiting the shaft at the bottom into the Quonset. This, in turn, displaced the coolest air in the house, pushing it back toward the barn to be reheated by the animals. He had created a slow, gentle, continuous loop of air circulation, a thermosiphon, powered entirely by the temperature differential between the two structures. The damper allowed him to control the flow. On warmer days, he could close it. On the coldest nights, he could open it wide. He wasn't just connecting two buildings, he was making them breathe together. That winter arrived not with a gentle slide, but with a roar. A mid-November blizzard buried the county in 3 feet of snow. And then the skies cleared, and a polar vortex descended from the Arctic. For 2 weeks, the daytime high never rose above 0, and the nights were a silent, lethal cold of 30 and 40 below. The wind was relentless, sculpting the snow into knife-edge drifts and driving the wind chill to unimaginable levels. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness. For the families in their conventional homes, it was a state of siege. The Millers, a young couple with a new baby, ran out of their firewood supply in the first week. Mr. Miller had to brave the drifts to beg for coal from his neighbors. The Olson family's prize bull, a massive Hereford, fell ill in their drafty barn. The vet said its lungs were freezing. Jedediah Thorne himself was struggling. His grand, sturdy barn was an icebox. A solid inch of crystalline frost coated the interior walls, and he spent his days with a hammer, chipping ice away from the cattle's water trough. In his own house, his wife cooked with her coat on, and the family lived in the 2 rooms closest to the big wood stove. At the Kowalski homestead, life was different. While the wind howled over the snow-covered roof of their buried home, inside was an envelope of calm. The small cook stove in the corner was lit, but it was for cooking and supplementary warmth, not for desperate life support. The air temperature held at a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. There was no draft. The only sign of the brutal cold outside was the thick layer of condensation on the lower half of the 2 small, triple-paned windows, the one surface exposed to the elements. The interior walls of the Quonset were cool to the touch, but they were not cold, and there was not a single speck of frost. Zofia baked bread, the warm, yeasty smell filling the small space, a scent of life and plenty that was unthinkable in the other houses of the county. Antek and Kasia, their cheeks rosy and healthy, played on a rug on the floor in their shirt sleeves. They had not had a single cough since moving in. Stan would go out to the barn twice a day through the connecting shaft. He didn't have to put on his heavy coat until he opened the main barn door to the outside. Inside the barn, it was a damp, earthy, but not unpleasant 45 degrees. His animals were calm, their coats dry, their breath pluming only slightly in the air. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. He was using less than a quarter of the wood his neighbors were burning, and his family was living in a state of warmth and security that the wealthiest farmer in the county couldn't afford. The mockery had lasted for a season. The validation was happening now in the silent, deadly heart of the Dakota winter. The crisis for Jedediah Thorne came on the coldest night of the year. The official temperature at the county seat was minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, not counting the wind. His prize-winning dairy cow, a Guernsey named Maybelle that was the pride of his farm, had gone into a difficult labor. The calf was breached. The vet had come and gone, doing all he could, but the outlook was grim. "She's losing too much energy just trying to stay warm, Jedediah," the old man had said, his words fogging in the frigid barn air. "If you can't get her into a warmer space, I don't think she or the calf will make it through the night." Thorne was a proud man, a man whose reputation was built on his competence, but he was also a practical man, and he loved his animals. His own barn was a death trap for a cow in such a weakened state. He thought of the other barns in the area. They were all the same. Then, an image surfaced in his mind: the quiet, stubborn pole and his foolish-looking, sunken house. He remembered Stan's strange words: "The animals are a furnace." Swallowing a lump of pride so large it felt like a stone in his throat, Jedediah Thorne pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf over his face, and lit a lantern. The walk to the Kowalski place was short, but in the knife-like wind, it felt like a polar expedition. The snow squeaked under his boots with a sound that only happens in the deepest cold. He saw the single warm light from the buried house's window and the dark shape of the barn beside it. He didn't go to the house. He went to the barn. He pulled open the heavy sliding door and stepped inside. The difference was immediate and shocking. It was not warm, not like a heated room, but the brutal, biting edge of the cold was gone. He took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of livestock and hay. But it was a living smell, not the dead, sterile scent of deep frost. He could see his breath, but barely. His lantern cast a glow on the animals in their stalls. They were placid, chewing their cud, not shivering and huddled as his own were. Stan emerged from the far end of the barn carrying a bucket. He wasn't even wearing a coat, just a heavy woolen sweater. He saw Thorne and stopped, his face betraying no surprise. "Jedediah," he said, his voice quiet. "Stan," Thorne began, the words catching in his throat. "My best cow. She's calving, and it's going bad. She's freezing in my barn. She'll die if she stays there." He paused, the request hanging unspoken in the air. Stan just nodded. "Bring her here." That corner stall is empty. It took 2 hours, with the help of Amos Pritchett, whom Thorne had roused, to move the laboring cow on a stone boat sledge across the frozen fields. They settled her into the corner stall on a deep bed of fresh straw. As Jedediah worked, he began to notice the details. There was no frost on the walls. The water in the troughs was liquid, not skinned with ice. He ran a bare hand along the interior wall. It was cold, but it was the cold of a cellar, not the soul-stealing cold of the outside world. When the cow was settled, Stan looked at Thorne. "Come," he said. "Zofia has coffee." He didn't lead him outside. He led him to the back of the barn, to the simple wooden handle of the damper he had ridiculed. Stan slid it open and gestured to the dark circular opening of the shaft. "The house is this way." Jedediah hesitated. He expected a blast of foul, stinking air. Instead, he felt a gentle, almost imperceptible current of warm, humid air brush against his face. He ducked his head and followed Stan into the culvert. The air was warmer here, and the sounds of the wind and the outside world vanished completely, replaced by a low hum he couldn't identify. After 20 feet, he stepped out into the Kowalski's home. The shock of it stopped him dead. It was not the wave of heat that hits you from a stove, but an enveloping, foundational warmth. It was silent, stable, and absolute. The room was bright, clean, and filled with the smell of coffee and baking bread. The 2 children were sleeping peacefully in a small alcove. Zofia smiled at him and handed him a steaming mug. He looked around the curved, painted walls of the Quonset. He reached out and touched the metal. He expected the biting, painful cold of steel at 40 below. The wall was smooth, dry, and only slightly cool to the touch. It felt impossibly, fundamentally wrong. All his experience, all his knowledge of building, told him this wall should be covered in a thick sheet of ice. But it wasn't. In that moment, standing in the quiet, warm, impossible room, everything clicked into place. The pit, the buried hut, the animals, the shaft. It wasn't a collection of foolish ideas. It was a single brilliant machine. He looked from the warm, painted metal wall to the opening of the shaft that led to his recovering cow, and he finally understood. He turned to Stan, his face a mask of awe and shame. "Stan," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I came here. I thought you just connected a house to a barn." He shook his head, looking around the room again as if seeing it for the first time. "You didn't. You gave them 1 heartbeat." By morning, Maybelle had delivered a healthy calf. Both were alive and well. The news, however, was not about the cow. It was about Jedediah Thorne. He became Stan Kowalski's most fervent and important advocate. When men gathered at the general store and made jokes about the prairie gopher, Thorne would silence them. "You go stand in his barn when it's 30 below, he'd say, his voice resonating with the conviction of a convert. "Then you come talk to me. That man isn't foolish. He's a genius, and we've been too proud to see it." Word of mouth is a powerful force on the prairie. That spring, after the thaw, a half-dozen farmers approached Stan, asking him to look at their land, to explain his system. Stan, a man of few words, shared his knowledge freely. He never gloated, never reminded them of their mockery. He just explained the principles with simple, direct language. But it was Jedediah Thorne who translated Stan's ideas into forms other builders could understand. He started incorporating Stan's principles into his own designs, building his sturdy oak barns, but now adding insulated foundations and designing convective connections to new, partially buried root cellars or workshops. The real tipping point came when a writer from the Dakota Farmer magazine, a popular regional publication, heard the story. He came out to Pembina County skeptical and left a believer. The article, published in the fall of 1949, was titled The House That Breathes with the Barn. It detailed the construction, the physics, and the staggering results. A 75% reduction in fuel consumption for home heating, a documented increase in milk production from the warmer cattle, and a near-zero rate of winter sickness for the Kowalski family. The article was a sensation. By the spring of 1950, more than a dozen Kowalski systems were under construction in the region, with farmers adapting the core ideas to their own buildings and resources. Some used concrete bunkers instead of Quonsets. Others connected their barns to their existing house basements. The core idea, symbiotic heating, had taken root. The quiet Polish engineer had not just built a home for his family. He had rewritten the rules of winter survival for an entire community, not through argument, but through the undeniable proof of a warm room on a cold night. What Stan Kowalski did with surplus steel, a shovel, and an intimate understanding of thermodynamics was a remarkable anticipation of modern building science. Today we call his ideas by different names. His buried home is an earth-sheltered structure, a design prized for its energy efficiency and stability. His use of the planet's constant temperature is now a core principle of geothermal heating and cooling systems, which use the Earth as a heat sink and source. The most sophisticated element, the passive convective shaft, was a forerunner of what engineers now call a heat recovery ventilator, or HRV. Modern HRVs are complex machines that use the heat from stale, outgoing air to warm up fresh, incoming air, saving enormous amounts of energy. Stan achieved the same effect with a simple, unpowered culvert, using his entire barn as the warm side of the heat exchanger. He had created a living, breathing building system that harmonized with its environment rather than fighting it. He was decades ahead of his time, proving that the most profound engineering solutions are often the ones that rely on natural principles instead of brute force. The story of Stanisław Kowalski and his buried house is about more than clever engineering. It's a story about the nature of systems and the wisdom of seeing connections where others see only separation. The conventional prairie homestead was a collection of isolated parts: a house, a barn, a family, a herd. Each fought its own separate battle against the cold. The house burned wood, the animals burned feed, and the family endured the hardship. Stan's innovation was not to build a better wall or a more efficient stove. It was to erase the lines between the parts. He saw the waste heat of the animals not as a problem of the barn, but as a solution for the house. He saw the cold of the earth not as a threat, but as an ally, a massive, stable anchor against the fury of the air. He wove the house, the barn, the earth, and the living creatures within them into a single, symbiotic organism. The family was warmed by the animals were sheltered by the barn, and the entire system was protected by the earth. Each part supported the others. The frontier did not ultimately reward the man who could withstand the most punishment, or the one who fought nature with the most ferocity. It rewarded the one who listened, who observed, and who understood that survival wasn't about conquering the environment, but about finding your place within its powerful, invisible flows. Stan Kowalski didn't defeat the Dakota winter. He simply stepped out of its way and let it rage harmlessly above his head, while his family lived in the quiet, steady warmth of a system in perfect balance. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. Liking the video and leaving a comment truly helps the channel grow. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Could a system like this work today? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and engineering concepts. The application of any building techniques, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. And this content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.